Welcome back to another episode of Legal Stories. Today we're looking at the case of innocent Kahyata versus Zesco Limited. Mr. Kahyata had waited over a year for power to be connected to his house in Livingstone. Feeling that Zesco had breached their contract, he took them to court. However, Zesco argued that according to their rules, they had not actually broken any promises. At the center of this whole fight was a rule called Regulation 14. The court looked at this rule very closely. It states, the payment of a capital contribution and connection fee does not bind Zesco Limited to make supply available by a given date, but every effort shall be made to provide the required supply within a reasonable time. However, in cases where supply must be made by a particular date, specific agreements must be entered into with Zesco Limited. In simple terms, Zesco was saying, just because you paid us does not mean we have to finish by a certain date. We will try our best, but if you want a guaranteed deadline, you need a special separate contract. Mr. Kahyata pointed to a quotation he received which mentioned a 6-month period. He thought this meant Zesco promised to connect him within that time, but the judges interpreted the documents differently. Here is how the court broke down the process. First, the customer was expected to pay a fee within 90 days to start the process. Second, the customer had to sign a supply contract. Third, once the money was paid, Zesco would provide the power at the earliest possible time. The judges noted that this was subject to Zesco getting the right approvals for the route where the wires would pass. They clarified that the 6-month mention in the quotation was actually an obligation for the customer to have their house ready for connection, not a deadline for Zesco to finish. What is a reasonable time? Since the contract did not give a specific date, the law implies that the work must be done within a reasonable time. Reasonable time is not a fixed number of days. It is a legal concept that means the time needed to do a job based on the specific situation. The court explained that what is reasonable depends on the subjective circumstances of each case. Subjective means looking at the specific details and challenges faced by the people involved, rather than a general one-size-fits-all rule. In this case, the subjective details included the fact that Zesco had to source specific materials for the job, the global delays caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the fact that Zesco is the sole supplier for the whole country and is often overwhelmed. Because of these challenges, the court decided that taking 1 year and 2 weeks was actually reasonable in this specific situation. Having considered all the grounds of appeal, the court found that Zesco was not in breach of contract. The appeal was dismissed. What can we learn from this judgment? Payment is just the beginning. As we saw in Regulation 14, paying your connection fee does not automatically create a deadline for the company. Specific needs require specific contracts. If you are a business owner and you absolutely must have power by a certain date to avoid losing money, a standard application is not enough. You need a specific agreement with a fixed date. Context matters. The law does not look at a delay in a vacuum. Judges will consider outside factors like pandemics or the logistical reality of a company being the sole provider for millions of people. Read the whole document. Mr. Kahyata focused on the mention of 6 months, but the court focused on the phrase earliest possible time at the end of the document. The last paragraph of a contract often clarifies or limits everything written above it. Thank you for joining us on Legal Stories. Always make sure you know exactly what the fine print says before you sign. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.